I'm going to take us on a 20,000-year journey through brass instruments in an hour. So we need to run at times. The story is very patchy. At the beginning, it's very quick. Later on, it gets much slower. The evidence we've got is made up of all sorts of things. Some of it's made up of physical instruments that we have, like you see here. Some of it is made up of little statuettes and things like this, which inform us. Some of it is made up of, a lot of it is made up of iconography, pictures on tombs, pictures on walls, pictures on all sorts of places. But we've got to start at the beginning, and here we have the beginning of people arriving, not only just in Europe, but in the world. And around this sort of period here, around 120,000 people began to spread out of Africa and to move into this part of the world. The earliest information we have of any cultural value comes from these objects here that are generally referred to as Venus figurines. I don't like the term, feminists don't like the term, so I prefer to use the term female figurines. This is one of the problems we have in this subject. If we use the term Venus, it has all sorts of connotations and it attaches all sorts of ideas to these objects. Now, these are not huge objects. They are relatively small. They can fit in your hand. They're that sort of size. And they're certainly not things for a great deal of show. They're things for people to hold and people to walk round with. And one of the things we have to be aware of is the population of Europe at this time. The population was very, very small, incredibly small. And the number of these figurines we have is very large for the size of the population. So we're talking about, in this period here, 4,000 to 6,000. In this period, 30,000 for the whole of Europe, right into the Urals, the whole thing. So very, very small populations. A little after this, Willendorf, comes this figurine from Lausel. Significance of this figurine is it's holding something. Now, to start with, whoever made the figurine was making something important to them. So what it represented was important, and also what this lady was carrying was important. So we're starting to get some idea of the culture at this time. Some people, Maria Gimbutas calls this a goddess. Although I like her work, I don't agree with the term goddess. I prefer to think this as I'm going the wrong way, just a minute. I prefer to think this as a personification of nature. It's not a goddess. The term goddess is imposing, again, ideas on the whole thing. There are a lot of them around. They're all of these females in this sort of state. All naked, and there are a few males. This is what she's holding. It's a shell. It's a horn. It's not just a horn. It's a horn with markings on it. It's got 13 markings on it, and the 13 is equal to the 13 lunar cycles in the year, and it's also equal to the 13 female cycles in the year. And this is a connection we get all through antiquity, this sort of connection. And this is a model of the importance of the female at this particular time. All the evidence we have of any cultural aspects are of the female at this time. The males were hunting, so we have axes and daggers and things that are from hunting, but that's all we have of the male part of society. We don't have anything like these figurines, which tells us something of the human side. We have the tools from the male society. So we have this connection with the moon, the new moon particularly, And this connection goes through the lunar cycles to nature. Through the females, it goes through menstruation into that. So we have this cycle of the female cycle. The female then looked after the children and gave them maternal care. So all the enculturation of the children at this time was in the hands of the female. When it passed into the males, the young girls, the girls naturally were part of nature. They began to become fertile females through nature. Nothing made them, nature made them. But with the boys, they had to move out of the female world and move into the male. And that's when we get these male initiation ceremonies. And these become very important because the male culture is being passed into the boys through the males, not through nature, whereas through the females it's passed through nature. And here we know in Greek and Roman times, the horn of plenty, the cornucopia, is the sign of nature, the sign of plenty, and it features clearly the horn. The first thing we have, the first appearance of anything like an instrument connected with this period is from Mausulas between 17,000 to 10,000 before the present. This is how accurate we are with the dating. We can't date it any earlier than that. But the point about that instrument, it is a blowing seashell instrument because the blowing hole's carefully made, this is all smoothed out, and it's been used. So we know this is the first appearance of this kind of instrument. And it is a seashell, which we will see is a really important part of the society. Seashell horns are found mainly where the seashells are found, which is not surprising, this creature can only live between the 54th parallels where the sea is warm enough for it to live. So that's the distribution. But we have heavy distribution around the Mediterranean world. This is the distribution. If I put all the finds in the distribution, that would be black, because there are a lot of finds. So we have over 200 finds. We have 200 finds of seashell trumpets out of my catalogue of ancient instruments shows about 384. So 200 of those are shell trumpets. So they're hugely important in this very early period. They're almost exclusively found in caves. So, and caves we know from writings in Linear B script, which is the script before Greek script, that the caves were seen as mystical places and connected with fertility and recreation and rebirth. We know they were ritually deposited because they were deposited alongside the bodies of children, very carefully laid out. And we can't understand, we can't interpret the layout, but we can say it was ritual. They're decorated with ochre along a lot of things, but importantly, they showed alongside non-blowing shells. So it was the shell, not the blowing instrument, which had the importance, and the blowing instrument presumably had extra importance because of its capability of being a sound tool. And they're often found in caves which have good sonic qualities, and they're found where areas where you could get a good echo so the sound can be heard well. The cowrie shell is very similar to this shell, and it tells us a lot, the cowrie shell, because we've got a lot of information about it from various times. It was seen as a symbol of fertility. In ancient Israel, the priests had cowrie shells fastened around their robes to keep them safe. From the shape, it was seen as representing the vulva, the female reproductive bits, and the modern name derives from the goddess Cowrie, who is a pre-Vedic god and the female gate of life. And in ancient Greek, the word kateos means cowrie shell and vulva. So we get in all the time this connection with birth and rebirth and and the shell trumpet. If we look where we particularly find them in later period is the Minoan period. We find images like this. This is not a blowing shell, but we find shell trumpets in a variety of different materials, carved in very hard rock, very hard stone, and we find pottery instruments, and so it's in this Minoan world. And we know in this Minoan world that they're connected with the gods. And we know from things like this Phaistos disc, which has only very recently been interpreted. Nobody knew what these symbols were. But now we know that it's in a mixture of Cretan hieroglyphics, which are very loosely based on Egyptian, but it's also showing Linear A and Linear B, which developed into Greek. So it's showing this story. And it talks about the goddess Artemis, who is a goddess throughout Europe, into Wales as Arian Hod. So, and this is one of the images of shell trumpets on that thing, on that disc. And these are some of the words that relate. So it talks about the pregnant mother or the mother goddess. And what it does talk about, and this is the important bit, is the goddess who grows dim. It talks about religion changing. It talks about ideas changing. Something's coming on in this period. And what is coming on is that we're starting to get information about male societies. And this is what's happening. We're getting a big splitting throughout Europe. Here is Crete, where Minos was. But up here, we're getting, or we got a bit earlier than this, we got this. And we all know about this global warming. But we got global warming on an epic scale. This was the retreat of the ice. And we got 10 degrees of warming over 10,000 years, which was phenomenal. What that did was dramatic. The hunting was of the large mammals like the mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros. And so living was stationary. People were stationary. But as the mammoths went, the hunting had to change. They had to start hunting aurochs and bison and things like this. So life changed. This was a change for the male part of society because hunting was in the male domain. And we got these changes in late Stone Age. We got a change of hunting styles. We got the agricultural revolution, which changed the whole nature of introduced farming. And interestingly, in the Neolithic, we got an understanding of the male role in reproduction. Before this time, the males didn't know they were involved in reproduction. There's all sorts of myths about reproduction. In China, a dragon breathed on you and a lady became pregnant. Or in some places, you bathed in this lake and you became pregnant. So the males didn't know they had any part in reproduction. And this knowledge changed males' view, and it changed relationships. And this is a very profound change in these societies. And it affects, we will see it does affect brass instruments dramatically. And the third one was writing. We got the beginning of writing. And of course, writing passes ideas on and changes things. So we got this change. We got the growth of stored wisdom. And it was stored in the shaman. And Caesar wrote of the Druids in Gaul and said some of them spent 20 years learning all the myths and legends of their society. And we got writing and we got priests, rabbis, gurus going on like that. So the shaman was someone who talked to nature, interpreted nature. We know about gods and how gods control nature. But the female side stayed as a personification. And then we get power relationships starting to grow. I don't want to look too much about the shaman, but then we start to get instruments made. Not instruments just from nature, but instruments that were made. And this is human beings starting to control nature. This is one of the oldest of these horns we have, from about 3,500 BC, so it's about 5,000 years ago. And you can see it's the shape of a horn, but it's got this larger cup on it. So human beings are starting to control nature. And this is a big change. We can look at this cup and say, well, it improves the impedance discontinuity at the end. We can look at all sorts of things, but it's controlling nature. It's in some ways mimicking what we see on the shell trumpets. It's creating a chamber at the end of the instrument. So this, and we get this at the bottom one is a Chalcolithic trumpet from Israel. And now we start to get different instruments together. And this is where the male-female side, or the power nature side of brass instruments comes in. And we get all these different complementary dualities in instruments. The lures, everybody's seen these lures on lure pack butter and things. The important things about these are left and right. And left and right in the ancient world, and still in lots of parts of the world, means male and female. If you're going, and this is all the way from Egypt up to Skara Brae in northern Scotland. So these are they are left and right instruments. We can't say they were male and female, but we know that left and right did mean male and female. This is looking at some ethnographic examples. Ethnographic examples are very dangerous because we're looking at societies very far away and very different. But they can enable us to think of ideas that we wouldn't think of otherwise. This is an instrument from Peru, the wakrapuku. It's played by two men when a field of maize has been planted, and they walk round and they pray for the god of the rain to come and give them a good crop of maize. If you ask these men what their instruments are, they will tell you their instruments are male and female. They won't be able to tell you which one's male, which one's female, but they tell you that they're male and female. So the idea lives on. And we've got this problem here of explaining. How do we explain the fact that in the ancient world we've got ideas, and in the ethnographic world, thousands of miles away, we've got the same ideas? And how do we explain that? And it's difficult. I personally think you have, through this female cycle, you have many ideas being inculcated by the female in the female world, and some form of cognitive DNA being passed on. This is a thought process. This is passing through society. Who knows? We can't say. So we have this sort of situation. Then, if we go back a little bit, we have figurines like this one. And this is quite early. This is 25,000 BC, before present. And if we look at this, this portrayal with this large vulva is what one sees at childbirth. At childbirth, you will see the opening for the child to come out. So this could be a representation of childbirth. And we see it on ethnographic instruments. Here is an instrument from Western Africa of a female. It's clearly a female who's pregnant. In some societies like this one, there are three genders of female. There are prepubescent females, there are fertile females, and postmenopausal females. This one you look at is clearly a pregnant female, so she's a fertile. But when you look inside you can no longer blow this as a side-blown instrument because it is blocked very carefully by clay. So it's been changed from a fertile female into a postmenopausal. So this is animization. This is changing something into something which is animated, which has some sort of animal-like qualities. So, and again, that is obviously an ethnographic example and all the dangers that go with it. Other examples we have of dualities are in the Irish horns, and the Irish horns are one side blown and one left blown, and we have 104 of these. So they're a pretty significant bunch of evidence Again, we don't know what the nature of the complementarity is. They're complementary because they're both pretty much the same shape and they're both brass instruments. They're clearly complementary. But what is the complementarity? It could be female. This is the shape which females are represented, and it has a blowing hole which could be seen as genitalia of the female. In the same way, the other one that we see above it has this extension, which could be a phallic extension. This could be another example of male and female in this world. We don't have any iconography from this period. We don't have any writing from this period. We have these horns. We don't have a single one that was dug on a dig. They're all found by people who are digging peat out to keep the fires going in Ireland. So we don't have any more information than the actual instruments. This is the grave at Chivik. This, again, with no dating on this, and it's now disappeared. But it's a cyst. It's probably quite an old one. But again, you can see we have two instruments which are pretty similar, but they're played in different ways. Now, whoever did that was putting something significant into the design. Again, we don't know what the significance is. We do know at this time the sun god was important. We have chariots of the sun god. So it might be that this one is going up to the sky to address that realm. We don't know. If we look at these, this is another complementary duality. And this one we don't know quite a lot more about. This is the shofar and the chatotra from ancient Israel. We don't have any examples of either of these that have survived from ancient times, but on this coin we do have that picture. It's on the coin from the Bar Kokhba, which was the second Jewish revolt against Roman rule. And, sorry, I've not got control of this thing. We have writings where God said unto Moses, make thee 2 trumpets of silver. So it was God and Moses, were a pretty powerful couple, yeah? And so the instruments that were made, these chatotra, were clearly important instruments in terms of their role in society. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a really excellent account of these instruments being used in war. The chatotra were blown by the priests. They were always blown by the priests. The shofar were blown by the Levites, by the ordinary people. And so when the second temple was destroyed and the priests were no more, the chatotra disappeared totally. So we have that duality. But when we look at the shofar, this is a modern shofar with a straightened out section. When we look at the iconography, and we do have some iconography, it's a bit late, it's about 200 to 250 CE. All the chatotra, all the shofar we see are this shape. So something has happened at some time to the shape of the shofar. It's explained in the Jewish world today by saying that they were not allowed to use the horns of a cow because of the worship of the golden calf. So, but this is a lot of the information of these Israelite instruments is really quite late, around 1350 and that sort of date, which for me is quite late. Abraham, who was told to sacrifice Isaac on the mountain, he sacrificed the ram instead. And from the ram, he made a shofar. From the right horn of the ram, which was the biggest, he made it was the largest. He made an instrument which would be heard in times to come. And that's normally translated as being at the sound of the last trump. And that's where we get this from. Yeah? And the trumpeters among you will have all heard that sound, and you take a deep breath and the trumpet shall sound. Yeah, and that's where this comes from. And what we're seeing in the chatotra and the shofar, we're seeing a power relationship. We're seeing that the chatzotze was the instrument of power. The shofar was the instrument of the church, not the church, the synagogue, the temple. Yeah, so we're seeing a difference between those two instruments, and it's a difference we see all the way through the ancient brass world. If we look here, this is the didgeridoo, and these stories of creation, the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised. These stories of creation are everywhere. In this in here, Kawade, who is the mother goddess, the mother of creation, the mother of nature, she blows the first children out of the pipe of the didgeridoo. So again, in the early days, we've got this chamber idea on the shell trumpet. So the shell can be seen as a chamber from which humanity emerges. And this is very strong in the early time. But here we see that by this time, all instruments are being seen as chambers from which people can come, from which resurrection can come. And this is very strong in this first Australian culture. And there's lots of creation myths, and I won't go into them in detail. In Aztec culture, in Hindu iconography, the sound was described as the primordial sound of creation. Some branches of Buddhism, and we saw, if you were here at the first concert, you saw the shell trumpet being played in a Buddhist context. So these ideas are still around. But there are other kinds of complementary dualities. This is Etruscan. And here we see a complementary duality of a lituus, which is this J-shaped instrument, being played with a cornu, the curved instrument. Many people say this is what passed into Roman life. I don't believe it is, but and we'll talk about why. What we don't, the J-shaped instrument was also the instrument of the augur, and the augur was the person who looked at the flight of birds, looked at the thunder and lightning, and predicted what was going to come. Because he's from the classical world, we don't call him a shaman. We're not allowed to call him a shaman because it's a classical world, yeah? And they don't have shamans. That's for these other people. But what else was that person? The augur was a shaman who predicted what was going to happen from the... And what did he use? He used this thing, and on much of the iconography, we cannot tell whether it's a ritual wand or whether it's a brass instrument. We simply cannot tell. So this is connecting that instrument, and this is full. All these pictures are so full of meaning when you start to understand them. Here we see the folding stool, and the folding stool is the stool that rich people had somebody carry about with them. We've got a Greek text that says, here's a folding stool and a boy to take you to market with it. So all these pictures are full of these sorts of ideas. This is a copy of the Pian di Civita Lituus, which I made just to look how it played whatever. And we can see it has a cast bell and it has a long tube. And the significance of this is this is at the borderline between ancient technologies of casting and more recent technology of making things from tube. And it also starts to illuminate an idea, which is seen later on, that long tubes, and especially tubes which have this helical winding, are a conduit. And they're a conduit from our world to other worlds. In the case of the Etruscans, the Etruscans were really heavily into the dead. They liked the dead. They spent a lot of time in tombs. They took the dead bodies out and when it was sunny so that the dead bodies could get a bit of sun. And they were heavily into that sort of thing. And this is generally played like that. It's played down to the earth. But it has this helical decoration on there. By the end, I shall learn to control this thing. That's a promise. But we see this as a junction on one of these instruments, the instruments in Berlin. And we see this decoration here, which is an arcuate decoration, which is a decoration of the new moon. And we see this on quite a few of these instruments. And again, this is harking back to this idea, is this hybrid instrument a mixture of male and female? Do we have this instrument which is spanning both these different cultures? And of course, that same idea goes for this guy, the Lituus, the Carnix, and this guy here. And it clearly is of the same breed. It's an instrument that has a bell on it. It has a long tube on it. Many of these instruments have windings wrapped around them, and we see it on iconography, we see it on coins. So we've got the same sort of ideas. And here, much of our evidence comes from coins. These are native coins. This Tascivanus, who came from Verulam in modern St. Albans. This is a Roman coin showing 2 cornices. And much of our evidence comes from here. The question of how these instruments were used, we do not know. We have no idea whether the carnix was used as a ritual instrument or whether it was used in warfare. It's generally said it's a war trumpet, but I tire of reading about trumpets and people adding before them war trumpets, because it's too simplistic. And we've seen already that these instruments were used in all aspects of life. And we particularly see this in the Greek world when we're looking at the carnix, the salpinx, which is this thing, which of course has on it a chamber. Yes, it has at the end. This is, the Greeks termed this a codon, which means bell. So they were the first people to use the term bell on an instrument. And of course a bell is apotropaic, i.e. it wards off evil spirits. So we have an instrument here with that thing on it. When we read about the Greek use of the salpinx, it is used in every walk of Greek life. It is everywhere. Of course it's used in war. Yeah, it's used, and a lot of the accounts tell of its use in war. But if you were taken to court in Greece and you were found guilty of a capital offence, and that means they were going to chop you up and get rid of you, then if you hadn't been called to court by the salpinx, you could get off. And we have accounts of people saying, nobody sent the salpinx to my house, and they get off. So the salpinx was there in all aspects of life. In the Olympics Games, the salpinx started off every race in the games. It called the competitors in. It blew to start the race. If it was a long race, it blew on the last lap of the race. It blew to bring the victor in to get their reward. So the salpinx was there all the time in the Olympic Games. In 396 BC, the Olympic Games, which was held in Hellas, the other city-states argued that we want to provide the herald. We want to provide somebody who plays the salpinx. So in 396, they instigated a competition. So for 400 years, the first competition in the Olympic Games was the trumpet blowing, the salpinx competition. So we trumpeters were the most important people in there. It didn't start without us, yeah? If you read some authors, they will tell you exactly what the competition was about. They will tell you it was the loudest, it was the longest, it was this. We don't know. We don't have a single account of the nature of the competition. But we do know that the competition was there. We do know that the first person who won the competition was a local, which really annoyed everybody else because a local won the first one. But we know about Herodorus of Megara. We know that he won it either 8 or 10 times, depending who you read. We know that when he picked the salpinx up to play, everybody left because he was so loud. So we do know, and we know that at the siege of Argos, his king Demetrios Poliorcetes said, we can't capture Argos, we must give up. He picked up 2 salpinxes, played it, marched up, they followed him, and they captured Argos. So, he's got a statue, he had a statue raised to him, he was given the freedom of the city. So once upon a time, we didn't have to creep in the back door with a musician's pass. Yeah, once upon a time we got treated properly, but there we go. So The Gundestrup cauldron is one of the few pictures we have of how the cornix was used. There's lots of arguments about this. There's lots of arguments about, but we don't know about the blowing thing. And if we look on this instrument here, it has a straight tube. There is no bend on the bottom to blow it. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of argument about that. I went to look at a thing in the Südtirol, and a fellow, a really nice guy who with a metal detector had found parts of a cornix. He kept bringing me bits. He says, do you think this is a bit of a cornix? And my eyes were getting wider and wider and wider. And he brought a bit that was shaped like that, an L-shaped bit. And he said, the archaeologists tell me this is a bit of modern plumbing. And it was cast. It had a narrow bit on the end. It had a bit joint. It was this bent bit on the bottom of the cornix. It was the blowing bit. So we do know that they did have this bent bit. So we know that the instrument was held vertically, so we know a lot more about it. So how do we interpret that? Well, this is my idea of how we interpret that. That, remember, we talked about shamans. This was a shamanistic society. This was a society where somebody interpreted, somebody communicated with the upper world. Here, the scene is divided into two bits. And you'll see, well, I'll put the original back in a minute. And this is a lotus frond in my mind. The lotus grows on the surface of water. And the surface of water is the division between our world and the world of our ancestors. So we're looking at here a division. Not a division, I don't think, into the human sphere and the sphere of the ancestors, but I think this is the celestial sphere. We have a ceremony with an officiant. He's bigger, but important people were drawn bigger in the ancient world. This was the way you did things. And here we have the cornix players, and we have here personifications, earth, wind, earth, fire, and water here. If we look here, here are the cornix players. Their breath is in the earthen sphere, and the sound is in the upper sphere. And this is my interpretation, that they were talking to the upper sphere. They were talking not to the gods, because they didn't have gods, but they were talking to the upper realm. So that's my interpretation of the vertical cornix. One of the things we get on brass instruments is animization. Instruments being made to look like other things. And this is one, when that instrument, 7 of those were found in, we say in the UK they're like London buses. We waited 350 years for one to come along, and 7 came along together. Yeah? So 7 cornices were found here. And one of them, this is one of them, and it's made in a different technology. All the others are cast, well, no, that's not true. Some are wrought. This is the only one which is riveted, and it's a serpent. And the serpent is everywhere in the ancient brass world. This coil round instruments, this helical, is sometimes interpreted as serpents. So if we look at animization, and we go back to the first Australians, the didgeridoo isn't interpreted as a serpent. It becomes the rainbow snake. So this animization is metaphorical animization. It's not physical. It doesn't look like a snake, but in the heads of the people it becomes a snake. And why is this? Because of the, if you like, the cognitive DNA, the building up, the myths, the legends. They learn to understand it in that way. So this animization is everywhere in the ancient brass world. If we look at instruments like this again, you know, I accept the dangers of ethnographic work. This is a Maori instrument, the putorino, and the putorino is an instrument that is both male and female. It's the shape of it is the shape of the chrysalis of the moth, and it's, if you blow it in the middle, it's a flute. If you blow it on the end, it's a trumpet. And the players will tell you, blow it on the end, it's male. Blow it in the middle, it's a flute. we see this linkage between the flute and the trumpet all over the ancient world as well. And we see it because, in my mind, because both these instruments are nothing more than a bit of tube. And you don't have to add a reed, you don't have to add anything else, you add a person, yeah? And so this is a different form of animization. What they're doing, they're mimicking the female case moth sits on a branch and sings, and that attracts the male. And that's what this is mimicking, not the animal, but the action of the creature. This is another Maori instrument, and you recognize the shell trumpet on the end. And again, this is a hybrid instrument, and the conch shell is seen as the gift of that god of the sea. This is seen as their forest god, and again, you could interpret this as female and this as male. And so again, you're getting, especially in Maori instruments, you get this sort of relationship. We get complementary dualities everywhere. This is from Apulia, at the very bottom heel of Italy, and this shape, this mixture of straight instruments and horn-shaped instruments we see everywhere. I can't explain this. This is on a vase, but this is a good example of this kind of complementary duality. If we look at Celto-Iberian is very interesting because it's one of the few places where females had equal rights with males. The other place was Etruria, the Etruscans. And this was very dangerous in the Romans hated this. You got females, how can you have a female having rights? So the Romans had to wipe these out, and they did, brutally wipe them out. But Strabo, who was writing about this, said that the males and females danced promiscuously to the sound of the aulos and the trumpet. So this is one of the places where we get the woodwind, the aulos, which is a woodwind instrument with the brass instrument together, and we get them played together. This is and the instruments are very different from anywhere else in the ancient iconography. All the brass instruments are played by males. We don't have a lot. There's 10 images, and they're all played by males. There's 15 images of the aulos. 10 of them are played by females, and 5 by males. So we have here the male-female divide based on fundamentally on the instrument. And in the ancient world, I've got the list of around 200-odd players of the instrument, of the brass instruments, and only one of them is female. So brass instruments are overwhelmingly male in the ancient world. This is from Catrinella, a little bit further north and in the middle. And this is where you've got a cornu, a U-shaped cornu being played with a tuba. And this is at a funeral ceremony, and in the rest of the funeral there are aulois being played. This is where I think the Romans got their idea for their instruments. And here we see complementary duality with a cornu and a tuba being played. So these are complementary. These are not all the complementary dualities. These are just some of them. For me, there are 12 Ps of brass instruments in the ancient world. This is how I like to look at them for myself. And you can put rings around them, and this is the female ring, the natural, the nature, permanence, posthumanence, i.e. resurrection, procreate. I struggled to find a word beginning with P to describe that, so apologies. Procreation, protection and prosperity, and proxy. All branches have proxies. Instruments are always proxies for something. They have some kind of meaning representing something else. This is the religious, if you like, side of it, talking to the gods, piety. And then you have prestige, projection, and power. Projection, you see it with the carnix projecting itself up in the air. You see it with the salpinx projecting it in the military thing. And then here you have communicating with nature. And you can characterize all instruments with those 12 Ps. What's interesting in the Roman example is that the Romans used the tuba and the cornu together, and they're found together in battle. They had the tubalistrium, which was a ceremony where they blessed the tuba. There's nothing like that with the cornu. And the tuba is the male instrument. And you see this all the time, where the tuba-type instrument is treated differently. Oh, that's just some of the connections. These are just some of the problems we have in connecting these instruments together. This is how I interpret ancient instruments. I interpret them as vessel-shaped instruments, instruments in which something can either be created or it can live, it can repose. Tubular instruments, which something passes through, they're conduits, or hybrid instruments, which are a mixture of both of them. And I find that, for me, helpful. Now, I want to look at this instrument, and this is interesting. In the course of putting this presentation together, I came across this, and I thought, well, this is the earliest, supposedly the earliest, between 43 and 35,000 years ago, and it's from Geissenkloesterle, and it's called a flute. Yeah, and I thought, well, a flute, it's a bit of wood, it's a bit of bone actually. It's a bit of bone with holes in. And so I went in my workshop and I thought, do I have a bit of something with a hole in? And I found a broken bit of a Roman tibia that I'd been making. Yeah, it's 3D printed. It's got holes in. And I thought, now is that a flute? I'll have to put the microphone down. I'm not a flute player. Some people say I'm not a trumpet player either, but that's unkind. And if I just... So it's this flute. And this is one of the problems we have. Everything we interpret is interpreted by analogy. And the analogies that we apply are the analogies we are aware of. So whoever picked that up, and there are later instruments which are fipple instruments, which are clearly flutes, and they've said these are of the same genre. But this instrument can be played either way. So we have to be careful in this whole business on how we interpret these things. And I would say that we have to title it the earliest prehistoric wind music, not the earliest prehistoric flute. So all I'm saying is everybody else is wrong. You know, there we go. Somebody's got to say it. This is my favorite picture. If you go to Roman times, this is my favorite picture. It was scratched on a wall in the Via Appia. It wasn't painted by an artist, it wasn't anybody. And it shows the tuba being played here, along with a cornu, and along with a hydraulis. And this marks the entry of the brass into the musical world, into art music. These are still arpeggial instruments. They are still instruments without any devices for changing the nature of the note. Some of the cornua in Pompeii that I've worked on do have a device, but that seems to be a device for tuning, not a device for changing the notes. And then I found this one, and I'd looked at this a lot of times, and I thought, well, why do you stick something like that on a tuba? So I started to experiment with it, and I blew up this bit on his finger. This is from a mosaic. And if you look at his finger there, you can see his fingers lifting up. So I made one of these, and I put a finger hole on. Oh, and it worked beautifully. And I thought, well, okay, one finger hole. Why not another one down here with this mechanism operating a finger hole? So I made this, and so that you squeeze that and it lifts that up. Well, it didn't work. So I carried on with my colleague, who I now work with, and we tried using gravity to open and close this, but this caught on the side, this didn't work. We're using no technologies that the Romans didn't have. I've made a lot of tibia and alloy, and they have very elaborate mechanisms on them. There are no mechanisms on here that are not seen elsewhere in the Roman world. And this was the final thing, and this works beautifully. So we have an instrument with 3 harmonic series from the Roman world. And that's what it gives us. I cheated a little bit, because instead of making a hole, I made a slot, so that when you pull it, it opens the slot progressively. So you've got a couple of glissandi here. That's cheating, but it works well. Yeah. So we've got these instruments. This is right at the end of the Roman world. So we've got these instruments entering the art world, art music, right at the end of the Roman world. And it's not surprising. They played with the hydraulis, which has a keyboard. And, it's a melodic instrument. And then I found this one. It's funny, I'd only seen one of these before, but when I made one, I started to see them everywhere. And this is a question of your eyes getting attuned to looking for something. And this one is quite interesting. This is very different. The mechanism looks very different. And I, first of all, started making it like this, so that this looks like a slider. And we see these sliders on Greek alloy. You see sliders like this. So it's not a new idea. It's around in Greek times. And with this one, I could get open 2 holes, which I thought was quite clever, but it didn't work that well. It was very difficult to get it to seal. So I then had I made one with a continuous slot. And I did say Martin and I made one. I work with Martin Sims, a friend of mine now. And this worked quite well. And this gives you a range of notes, because you've got a slot there and the hole moves along that slot. So you've got a whole load of different things. And then I got to thinking about this, and I thought, well, what about this? And I find this very exciting. I call this my tuba bone. And why doesn't that slider actually move the bell? And this isn't finished yet. This isn't fully working yet. I've got all the bits, and that's the next thing for me to do. But this is an idea where, at this time, it's clear they were experimenting at this time with the brass instruments. They were experimenting in giving them a wider range and enabling them to play harmonically, enabling them to play diatonically, or even, this would play chromatically, this instrument. And that's what I reckon this instrument will play with a slide. I reckon where his hand is on the bell, I can get about 1.5 tones. So it's chromatic over much of the range, and it gives you quite a nice instrument. This is the scene that I took it from. This has got 2 tubae on it, and this is, to me, very interesting, because here, this is another scene that I found. And here you see one of these keyed tubae. It's a very, very long one with the same sort of mechanism on. But you also see this instrument here. And this is a really long one, this guy here. And so I thought, well, I must make one of those. So I made one of those, and it turns out to be an 8-foot C. And it is fundamentally a Baroque Roman tuba. I've got one here. I need a player. Where's my player? I had a player to play it. Do I have a player? Yes, there's my player. And it's on the same scene as this instrument. So we've got specialization here. Here we have 2 different tubae shown on one piece of iconography. And where these are being used, this is being used in an actual race. There's a boxing match going on, pugilists going on, and here or where all the prizes are, and this guy's hanging around the money, so he must be a proper trumpet player, yeah? But they're both occupying different roles. So we've got specialization going on here. Now, we can hear what this sounds like. You okay with it? Yeah, yeah. And bear in mind, we cannot say this is what the Romans heard, but we can hear what you can do on that. So I've changed my mind about what the Romans could play on their brass instruments. I don't know if anybody else has. And next time I watch a film about the Romans, my wife won't go with me because I complain too much. But I hope you can see that the ancient world of brass was not just about blasting. It was not just about war. It was about much more. It was about meaning. It's about what instruments meant to societies. And the output, the sound, okay, the sound is part of that. But the fabric of the instrument, the presence of the instrument, was part of the whole story. And that was really my message. So, thank you. Do we have time for any questions, if anybody has any? Dare anybody ask a question? Come on, Marco, come on, you must be able to ask. I have to say, all the time, there have been so many suppositions, there's been so many ifs, so many buts, and the story is filled with them. We cannot help it. But sorry, I can't hear. Can you come and tell me? I've played the trumpet all my life, and I have to wear a hearing aid. So please, when you're playing, wear ear protectors.
So there is a early... I went very fast through so many thousands of years, so I recollect the clear relationship with the shaman and the function of the instrument, the position of the person in society. How much is that still present in the Roman time for those instruments? Were it just drunk trumpet players, or did they have a special function in the society?
Trumpet players in the Roman world were treated very differently at different times. At one time, we do have information, they were the fifth rank. They were people who owned less than £1,000 of copper. That's how people were valued. And at some times, we do know in Greek times that the salpintes, the salpinx players, were in the games were treated like royalty. They had statues to them, and they were very highly treated. We know something on Egyptian times about the trumpeters. We know more about the trumpeters in the Egyptian world than about any other trumpeters in the ancient world. We know because a guy called Pepetchau got caught with something he shouldn't have from a tomb. He caught him with some gold that was robbed from a tomb. He played at that opening of that tomb. He knew where it was. And he'd stolen that gold. from the tomb. So he was held up in court. He was taken to court. In court, he said, oh, it wasn't just me, it was the other trumpeter as well. So he named the other trumpeter, and he was dragged up in court. The other trumpeter said, well, he's only told me because he's having an affair with my wife. and so we know, and then we start to find out about his relatives in the court and all the people in the temple. So we know a lot about the position of the trumpeter from this guy who got caught. Yeah, and it didn't end up nicely for him, I'd imagine. We don't know what happened to him. But we have the whole trial on a papyrus in the British Museum. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. It tells us so much about the position of the trumpeter, of the player in that call. But other than that, they didn't matter. They didn't matter enough to talk about them. You know, in the army, the man standing next to the standard was always the cornu player, the cornichen. And that was a vital part in the whole process. But, you know, we don't know the status of the people or not. So it's very difficult. In terms of what we don't know in the early days is whether the people playing the trumpet... One of the things I put up on that slide was performance. These days when you do a performance, you're doing it to an audience and you're wanting to do a good job or whatever. We don't know how much of somebody playing in a temple, how much of that was a performance or how much of that was ritual. We don't know what they felt about what they were playing. Yeah, and unfortunately we don't have any of that. We just have stuff about their instruments. We can keep digging, and there's a lot of stuff still to dig. Well, not physically dig, but you know what I mean. Keep working on it.
So the other fascinating thing, especially when you talk about the salpings, but this is probably the other thing is you speak about the salpings where it's very obvious, but all the other brass instruments, they are very loud. They can be very, very loud. Yeah. In comparison to the rest of what was going on at that time, okay. What could match that loudness?
Okay. If we look at this instrument, this is copy of one of the earliest instruments around. And it's a very simple instrument. It just goes... But we live in a world where there's air conditioning, aeroplanes, everything. That sound in the ancient world was a very loud sound. That was the loudest sound a human being could make. And so just a bit of human breath, a human being making that sound, that had some sort of magic connotations. And these loud sounds in the very early world were very important. And so when I said that this was a human product, this is a human product that could create that sound. So it was something quite important. This is from a period pre-writing, so we don't... Even when we get writing, much of the early writing is not to tell us about how the instruments worked. It's writing, it's either a story, and Aesop's Fables, there's this story in Aesop's Fables about a trumpeter who was caught in a battle. And he said, oh, I only play the trumpet. And they said, yeah, but you lead the army and you lead the others on. And, you know, we have these sorts of stories. We don't have anything which tells us. It's Dimitrios Palaeolithic, writing about 200 CE. He wrote a book on music, and he said he classified all instruments as male or female. And he classified the trumpet, the salpinx, as male because it was loud and vehement. Yeah. He classified other instruments as female for other sorts of reasons. So it's very difficult. The writings, when writing does appear, it's not always terribly helpful, and we have to read a lot of it. And the other problem for me is it's all in Greek and Latin and things. And that's one of the problems about music archaeology, is that you have to tread on other people's toes. You have to tread on the toes of classical people, Egyptologists, Etruscologists. You have to tread on the toes of people who understand religion, on the toes of people who understand these other things. And you have to leap in. You have to close your eyes and leap in. And And when somebody questions it and says you're wrong, that's great, because you can ask them, why am I wrong? And that explanation enlightens your understanding. And as a music archaeologist, it's a dreadfully stupid game. You've got to be very arrogant and I don't know, to leap in and, go into all these other areas.
Any more questions? I have so many questions. So in science, the last decades, in science in general, the DNA analyses have been become so much more precise. It's so much more. We can, with a little bit of material, we can already read so many stories about the evolution of humans, for example, and so there is so much more information coming from less and less material. Will there ever be, what do you think, what is your prediction, will there ever be a possibility to do the same with acoustics? Will there be a way to measure acoustic traces?
The problem with acoustics on these instruments, particularly brass instruments, is quite acute, in that you all know the importance of the mouthpiece, and we only have fundamentally 3 instruments out of all the 384 or however many instruments there were. We only have 3 instruments which have mouthpieces attached. We do have mouthpieces, we do have instruments. So that's terribly limiting in terms of any acoustic appreciation, because you know the difference a mouthpiece makes. And that is a big problem. On this Carnix here, it's got a 3C. Yeah. It's not got. I've got Roman mouthpieces. We have fundamentally two different kinds of Roman mouthpieces, but we don't know which was on the tuba, which was on the cornu. We don't know. There was an instrument found in Scotland on one of the forts, which remains of a tuba which had a mouthpiece attached, but I cannot trace. I can find a mouthpiece, which was probably. I can't find any evidence of the tuba. So the evidence from the last century says it was a tuba. That would be really valuable if I could find that. So I have looked in all the museums and written to the museums. So it's a big, big problem. And in terms of what you were saying about DNA and methods of research and digging, modern archaeological digs reveal so much more than the past ones did. So much was thrown at. I was asked to work on an instrument in Dublin that had been found in a rescue dig. A dig done for money. Yep. And they came up with 8 pieces of, it wasn't a brass instrument, 8 pieces of tube. And when I saw it, my eyes lit up. Yeah, because it looked like a musical instrument. And I worked on it. And she contacted me a few months later and said, could you come back? We found some more. And what they did was go through the spoil heap. They'd gone through what they'd thrown away because they didn't realize it had any value. And in the end, we found 11 pieces of it. And a lot of digs are finding evidence of hallucinogenic drugs. And I talked about shamans. Shamans entered the world, these upper worlds, by out-of-body experiences. And the range of drugs they're finding now in archaeological digs is huge. It makes the hippies look like kids, yeah? And it was so important because it was their way of entering these other worlds. And so the idea of the shamans is really important. And the problem with the Carnix is we have these wonderful range of instruments. We have hundreds of coins with different shapes, but we don't have anything that attaches them to people. You know, I love reading about asterisk, yeah, because I feel I can understand. I know it's all made up, but it's so great to see a Carnix player. He gets into a lot of trouble, but it's great to read about a proper Carnix player somewhere. And it is a big problem. You know, you try and tell a story, but how much of it is a story, how much is based, as much as I can is based on fact. But a lot is, well, I don't know whether it's entertainment or information or what, yeah.